Welcome to a new episode of Adaptable, where we explore identity transformations, a pervasive term in our current world. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Daniel Wift, the CEO and founder of Kelp Blue. Kelp Blue is a pioneering green industry initiative that is bringing regenerative seaweed farming to the shores of Lüderitz. As this small and historic town in Namibia stands on the brink of a potential major town transformation, Daniel and his team are planting the seeds, or in fact the kelp, that may contribute to bring about a new economic and ecological identity of this legacy mining town. The impact Daniel, as well as other economic investors, are having on the town is raising the question about how one goes about transforming the identity of a town without losing a thread to its past. A warm welcome to Adaptable, Daniel. It's fantastic to have you here.
Thank you, Rita. Pleasure to be here.
From my perspective, the concept of Kelp Blue fits into what is increasingly being referred to as the blue economy sector. Is that right? And if so, what does it mean?
The blue economy sector means nothing else than anything to do with the sea or the ocean, and typically is used for newer, more sustainable industries rather than the traditional fishing industry. And so think of aquaculture, mariculture, so fish farming, shellfish, oysters, mussels, scallops, but think also of offshore wind, wave, tidal power, kelp farming, seaweed farming, combinations of these things. So that's typically what it's used for.
And just a bit more about the mission of Kelp Blue. Can you just inform our listeners what it's really about and how it might potentially impact Lüderitz from that perspective?
Yeah, at Kelp Blue we plant giant kelp, the biggest of the seaweed species. So these are really jungle giants. They're 20 meters tall from the seabed to the sea surface, and then at the surface they form these enormous canopies of big, sort of 2-3 meter long golden green leaves. And like trees are photosynthetic, so the reason we do it is to have an outsized carbon impact. Carbon is absorbed by the plants, released back into the ocean, floats away with currents. Some of that ends up in deep ocean sediments and is really sequestered for a very, very long time, or put away for a very, very long time. And the second impact that it has is biodiversity boost. So when you put a forest of trees in the ocean, you get an instantaneous accretion of life. The main product for the moment is a biostimulant, Stim Blue, which boosts crop yields quite significantly, as well as improving soil health. So for a farmer, you're getting instant profit and loss improvement in that year, but you're also getting long-term capital appreciation of the value of your
Incredible. I'm very much looking forward to joining you for a dive there one day, just to experience that. I'm almost visualizing what it must be like.
It's an almost spiritual experience. So
I can imagine.
It's this cathedral of trees, really, that you're snorkeling through. And then the sun comes through these golden green canopies and shoots through. It's a bit like a children's Bible with rays of sun coming down, and and then all the creatures and fish. It's great.
Daniel, you didn't start your career in the blue economy sector. In doing my research on you, I was amazed to learn that you were actually originally a sculptor, and then from there went on to study engineering that led to becoming a senior executive in the oil industry. How did these career transitions come about?
Yeah, I've always wanted to do 1,000 things and was never able to decide what I wanted to do. So I think I'd be happiest if I was able to do 20 careers at the same time, but one has to choose. And I'm also quite autistic in the sense that I can get completely sucked into and immersed in something and obsessive about it. And so these two quite opposite impulses, I suppose, are what lead to regular reinventions, not of the self, of you stay the same person, but of what you choose to spend most of your time doing during the day. So sculpting was an enormous passion. I moved into the oil industry to see a bit more of the world again, and to be among, let's say, more rough, less polished people for a while. Not really intending for it to be a permanent thing, but then that sucked me in, and I got obsessive about it, and was quite good at the drilling and people management and so forth. So trundled up the ranks, went from country to country, which kept things fresh as well. Every country is different. Every asset in the oil and gas industry has different challenges. Sometimes you're doing something new, sometimes something old. And then the move from the oil industry into seaweed was really driven by the sense that maybe we should be doing something more meaningful about the defining crisis of our age. we don't live in an age of war, but we live in an age where we have these accumulating, deep, interconnected crises of climate change, of biodiversity, and of the sort of the degradation of rural and poor communities and the disenfranchisement of poor communities, particularly in rural areas. And these three things are combined, and if we don't tackle them and fix them, our children are going to inherit a world that is much degraded. And I think we have a duty towards later generations to be better custodians. I would also like for later generations to look back at us and be proud of what we did rather than be ashamed of us.
I really like that. Hearing people like you speak about the world in that way is hugely exciting, because a lot of people might be aware of that challenge but shy away from it. And I think then speaking with people that actually want to lean into that and possibly contribute is very affirming.
A lot of people, I think, want to do something meaningful, which can be in all sorts of areas.
Of course.
It doesn't need to be climate change or biodiversity or poverty. It can be in art. It can be in anything. People have an enormous urge to do something meaningful, and yet a very sort of fragile and very limited sense of what they could possibly do. And this is something where I think we also need to take a hard look at our global culture at the moment and ask ourselves why we have such a narrow range of things that are defined as successful.
Correct.
And ask in a really spiritual sense whether that's a formula for success, and should it not be obvious to young people or old people that there are all sorts of other routes in life that can and should be enriching and successful in many different ways.
I look at it as a privilege to have lived in many different places across my life, and clearly so have you. In your opinion, what is this relationship between a place and a person? And to what extent can it or does it influences one's identity?
Again, identity is unchangeable and yet extraordinarily affected by the people around you, the place you're in. And so perhaps it's a bit like a relationship or a marriage even, that some places have a positive influence and reinforce what you're all about, and others, while they might feel exciting, aren't actually reinforcing your strengths. Place has this enormous knock-on effect on whether you feel grounded, whether you feel wholesome, whether you feel harmonious. And some places don't click, some cultures don't click. And so I think place is super important in terms of defining how our relationship with our day-to-day. Are we in a grounded place, or are we endlessly under stress or some sort of discomfort or unhappiness? So place is important.
I fully agree, and I kind of think, as I was preparing for this question, I kind of often thought about how people introduce themselves, and quite often they would say, look, I am Rita, I am South African, or I come from Cape Town. So even our introductions, we immediately associate a certain form of identity with a place.
Places are all like relationships, also to be discovered, and it's what you put in that you get out. So Georgia as a country jumps to mind, where I spent a lot of time. I met my wife there. She was working at the British Embassy at the time. And we were talking with her driver about why some of the embassy people came to this extraordinary place, to us, this magical place, mountains, amazing culture, amazing food, and absolutely hated it. And the driver said, well, Georgia is a place that gives you as much as you give to it. So if you come with an open heart, then it rewards you. If you come with a closed heart, then it gives you nothing. And I think that's actually true of most places, that what you put in, you get out.
As you speak, I reflect on my own experience, and it rings so true. The one thing that I also found is moving around a lot means you have to uproot and create a sense of belonging with a place quite fast. How have you and your family, perhaps, over time, create a connection with a place and its people, to create that sense of depth that allows you to then pick the best parts of it, of course. How do you go about that?
It all starts and ends with curiosity. As long as you maintain your active curiosity and open-mindedness, it doesn't mean you don't have strong opinions about pros and cons of a place, but you need to be able to abandon them if you get new information. And again, like a relationship, once you start taking a place for granted and you think you know what it's all about, then it starts to
challenge you,
go stale bit by bit. It's you have to work at it every day, and you have to you have to keep exploring and find the new things and dig deeper.
Absolutely.
And
And I agree. I also think that people respond well if you make the effort to understand their context, as opposed to come with your preconceived biases or cultures from another place and impose it there.
it's also obvious why studying a place also brings its reward.
Absolutely. No, I fully agree with you. As I understood, you've got for Kelp Blue potential pilot sites in New Zealand, possibly Alaska. How did it come about that you picked Lüderitz? For our listeners to understand, Lüderitz is in the middle of nowhere, really. It's this tiny desert town on the west coast of Namibia. So it is dry, it's harsh weather conditions. What made you and your family pick this place to settle?
It's partly deliberate and partly accidental. So when you look at growing our species of seaweed, giant kelp, the biggest of the seaweeds, sort of 20, 30, 40 meter tall trees, there's a specific set of climatological conditions that are optimal: water temperature, nutrients, etc. So we mapped all of that, and the little upwelling cells, or where deep water comes to surface at the coast, just around Lüderitz, is the richest in nutrients on the planet. And so it is the best place for growing seaweed. But it was also slightly accidental in terms of that I set up the company in early 2020. The idea was to scout Namibia, Chile, New Zealand, Alaska, and then pick where to start. And I'd done the scouting trip to Namibia first, and then COVID hit, so travel was not possible. And so accidentally, then it was just, let's forge ahead with Namibia. With hindsight, it's great luck, because as a startup, the key thing you have to do is focus. The stronger reason is that I think we have a strong preference for places that are exotic. All these places are exotic in terms of nature, but where life is a bit more challenging. So you have more contrast, wealth, poverty, unfinished places that still have raw challenges to tackle. I think we find much more rewarding.
It seems to be a theme for you, like you said at the inset, which fascinating. Yes.
What purpose do we have on life other than to try and improve the world around us? In Lüderitz, there's lots of challenges to work on and lots of rewards in doing so, and recognition and collegiality and sense of community.
What core themes came about that sort of shaped your mindset and approach to establishing there?
I think there's a strong sense of pride that is, it's never gloated. It's not a sort of nationalistic pride, but there's a strong sense of pride of being a rugged, remote community. Really, you get to the end of the world and then you continue some before you get to Lüderitz. So it's sort of like being an island in the middle of nowhere, but then it's got the desert rather than the ocean on the one side. And so it's communities that are that isolated and that dependent on extractive industries, and power is brought in, water is brought in, and if that fails, then that's sort of the end of the town or life. And in that sort of context, in my experience, communities can either become very closed and sort of viciously vendetta cultures, where you have these festering generational arguments and conspiracy theories, or they can become rather cohesive. It doesn't mean that there aren't dislikes and vendettas under the skin, but on the surface, we're together. We don't talk badly about each other. We support each other through thick and thin, because we survive or die together. That sort of attitude, and that's what we like about Lüderitz.
I love that.
I mean, we're not, to be honest, we're not quite sure why we like Lüderitz so much.
It's still figuring it out.
We never quite know.
On the windy days in particular, I'm sure.
No, we like the wind, but we never quite know why we like it there so much. Well, there we are. We do. We love it. And then
the thing that struck me, that is the fact that the Lüderitz people call themselves the Buchters, irrespective of ethnic background, and then unite behind that shared identity, for me is quite special. And like you say, that then transcends a lot of differences that might matter elsewhere.
It's a port town. I think that helps. Port towns are always more cosmopolitan. It is sort of end of the world and out of sight. I think the Lüderitz of today is extraordinarily sort of colorblind and cohesive.
Exactly.
And I think it wasn't necessarily like that.
I want to move us now a little bit to this concept of a potential town transformation. And you and I are well familiar with around the impetus, but just for our listeners, Like we said, Lüderitz was a historic mining town, now in rapid decline. It has some fishing industries, but again, not a lot, and some small tourism attractions. So it's not really had a huge recent economic viability assessment. And then along came you 4 years ago with Kelp Blue being established there. And then, at least from my perspective, happy coincidence of history, where decarbonisation strategies globally led to the Namibian government launching green industrialisation programs that ultimately led to Hyphen winning a tender that brings huge economic impetus. In essence, Lüderitz has this potential now, due to economic impetus, to become an aquaculture and or potentially a renewable energy hub. Now, with that could come various opinions of how big and or how far a transformation can happen. What would you describe is the potential of Lüderitz having a major new boom?
I think the views differ quite extraordinarily at the moment.
Exactly.
You get some people who talk with real conviction about how it's going to become a Singapore on the sea, and that will move the town boundaries by 80 kilometers and have 400,000 luxury villas and golf courses, golf course A and golf course B. And that sounds somewhat unrealistic to me. And then there are people who are very skeptical and say, none of this will happen, and it'll stay the same or get worse, and that sounds a bit unrealistic as well. There is a first renewable energy project going up, I think about 50 megawatts of power, so relatively small on a global scale, but they are latest generation, super tall, very impressive wind turbines going up in the desert. And that's, for power provision for Namibia and potential export to South Africa that probably has still a few decades to go to fix the damage of Eskom, seems a very sound first step. Whether hydrogen is economically and technically feasible, I think remains
to be seen.
And so how big that becomes is always the question, but some part of it will go ahead, undoubtedly. Oil and gas, I of course have a bit of a mixed feelings about, have it being an industry that I left behind and that I think is really, it's not the past. We will always have some form of oil and gas on the planet, but it does feel a bit like going backwards, and the potential positives and negatives of any of these industries for a town like Lüderitz, I think, are often poorly understood. So people think that a lot of jobs will be created. I think that that's unlikely. I think the quality of the jobs will be a lot lower than people expect.
I fully agree.
And people also don't fully appreciate how erratic that is, particularly in the oil industry. As the oil price spikes and collapses, that jobs, suddenly there's inflation in prices because there aren't enough people for the jobs, and then everybody's laid off. And that's, for a small town, that's a lot more damaging than
what is first assumed.
Than maybe even than the current sort of struggle of very low but fairly steady jobs. So I think that's underestimated. And I don't want to be pessimistic. There's also positive things around, obviously more infrastructure, flights, transport improvements at quite considerable costs.
Absolutely.
The oil and gas industry is not known for being have particularly sharp pencils when it comes to paying bills. So
ironically,
yeah,
one can look to Angola just to kind of do that comparison, right? There's a neighbor who has had this experience.
Yeah.
So one should look soberly to that comparison, I think, to know what it means.
Yeah. So I think there's that sense of people running after a shiny new toy, while there's also opportunities to improve the town that don't need any major new project to go ahead. So, for example, the traditional industries, fishing is a great example, in my opinion, should be actively reinventing itself, much as has happened in many places on the planet under the guidance of, let's say, the Blue Marine Foundation,
yes,
or, for example, to move from this high volume, very low value industry, which it is today,
yes,
where hake are being trawled up at large volume, turned into the lowest white flesh protein for the European market. This is dependent on subsidies of vessels and subsidies of imports, on subsidies on taxation here.
yes, yes.
And all kept because of the considerable job creation, which is politically very understandable. But the total catch that happens from Lüderitz could be reduced by tenfold if the margins increase by 10x, and you'd still have a more positive economic impact without such a degrading environmental impact. So these are opportunities that are there for the taking, and the existing, I think, monopolies or systems around fishing are not really motivated to grab them, and are probably tired as well from feeling embattled and under victim role for quite a while. So mining is similar.
Yes,
Diamonds,
true, very much so.
The diamond industry obviously is struggling. It will need to reinvent itself, and there is an approach of a more boutique diamond mining. The diamonds in Lüderitz are notorious for having quite interesting shades and colors, which traditionally is seen as sort of less grade unless it's pink. But I find them more interesting, and I'm sure on a planet with 8 billion people, there are other people who find them more interesting than the pure white ones. And so embrace what makes you unique rather than trying to become what everybody else is. I think there are a lot of potential avenues for improving and diversifying the town's economy that don't involve some huge new De Beers or a new huge entity that comes as the knight in shining armor to save everybody. Because that's never the reality. The knight is not there to save people. The knight is there to make a profit, to bring those dividends back to London, to Paris, to Windhoek. And, I'd like to see more of the profits being reinvested in Lüderitz.
Absolutely.
I'm the owner of ultimately what will become, God willing, a global company. I live in Lüderitz. That means that global profits will flow into Lüderitz. Let's see a bit more of that rather than having, London, Paris, I think, have enough profits already.
Fully agree. So I think your point of white knights is also well heard, because we've seen a lot of that, in fact, in Namibia, where there's been reliance on white knights. And if then they fall away, the towns are at risk or the economy is at risk.
Yeah.
So therefore, to your point, to diversify and build true, diverse and or textured economies ground up is really what lasts. The real heart that I was so looking forward to discussing and hearing your opinion about, Daniel, there's always the 3 major constituents, simplifying it around public sector, private sector, and civil society. And there always seems to be a challenge around who's responsible for transforming a town. In your experience, what is the role of the private sector, in your opinion, in driving or impacting town transformations, bringing about transformations in towns?
You get all flavors, and
Agree.
Ideally, it's a blend, but I think it's probably very specific to the place and the context. The private sector's involvement in Lüderitz is, I think, much too low. It's not enthusiastically embraced or supported or encouraged by government largely. In reality, I mean, there's talk of involving it, but that's not really translated into actuality. I think generally, some it's very cultural. Some cultures have a sense of cohesion and community and responsibility and moral imperative of thinking about subsequent generations or the poorer sectors of society. And in those contexts, whether the private sector dominates or the public sector dominates doesn't really matter. I mean,
relevant. Yeah.
And then you get cultures in which, typically because of historical trauma, whether it be civil war, genocide, or overly aggressive extractive colonialism in this sort of part of the world, where a lot of that cohesion has become fragile or has disappeared pretty much entirely and needs to be rebuilt. And those are probably areas where too much private sector involvement is not necessarily positive, because it can lead to simplistic sort of and fairly exploitative attitude, certainly when one company dominates. And I think that's been seen in the region with the extractive industries in the past.
Absolutely.
Although each of them brought positive things. The towns run by mining industries are often the best.
Oranium is a fantastic case of that.
Oranium, Zoutfontein, Rushpina, and that leaves a lot of infrastructural legacy that's positive. But it also leaves enormous community fragility
and dependency.
So Lüderitz is, I think, despite its sometimes terrible history, falls in the first category of having quite good cohesion. So I think a lot more private sector involvement would be beneficial.
Daniel, thank you for that sober answer. I think the part that I would love to hear your views on, because again, I speak with a lot of private sector companies, organizations that either's got a liability or interest or dependency on a town, and they vacillate between your attitude, very few, unfortunately, that are seeing it as a positive and contrary, leaning into wanting to contribute, as to those that are almost wanting to shy away of responsibility because they fear almost that public sector responsibility will inadvertently be shifted onto them, which they then struggle with in future. What is your opinion about that, around the potential of the private sector leaning over and essentially beginning to do or be invited or drawn into doing what the public sector should? Do you have any views on that?
Of course, everywhere there's a line of thinking that companies have some sort of duty to simply donate because they make profit, which is I find a very strange narrative that has been built around somehow that it's shameful to make money. And I think that's very damaging and very negative and leads to a lot of defensiveness and fake contributions from corporates. While the sort of private sector involvement I'm talking about is a one driven by self-interest. And so that's a broad spectrum. It can be as simple as saying there's a housing issue in Lüderitz.
Yes.
Well, why not? Why would we not enable people to make a bit more profit from building housing, rather than saying, well, the public sector is going to build housing, which the public sector is notoriously bad at doing things like this. Inefficient, slow, results are mediocre, haven't thought about maintenance afterwards, get ripped off by contractors, etc., if there isn't also then corruption and so forth. While the private sector for things like housing is extremely efficient, because if they don't build it well, then people don't pay the rents. So it would seem glaringly obvious that if there's a housing crisis in Lüderitz, that enabling the private sector to make money is the way to solve it, rather than saying, oh, let's not have any project developers because they're somehow vampires.
Absolutely.
So there is a bit of there's a serious issue, and it's not unique to Lüderitz. It's, I think, global, and as politics gets more polarized between people who don't seek the common ground and just finger point across, you get more and more people who seem to think that anything to do with making money is deeply evil, and other people who think that lot are deeply evil. And that's not a positive movement. But there's broader sort of private sector involvement. We have built a school, and there's some self-interest involved, not in terms of making money in this case, because it's a not-for-profit. Well, that too.
Create a job for yourself.
Doing what we love and creating a job, certainly. But even simpler, I have 3 children of school-going age, and so when we came, setting up a school was seemed an obvious thing to do. But then from the more altruistic side, it's the need that we identified in this particular town that is addressable at relatively low cost. And there's also a company self-interest. So a town in which there isn't a high enough quality transferable sort of level of schooling heavily restricts the type of people I can employ. It either means I have to either hire people who aren't married or with children yet, or are beyond that stage. And so that whole middle sector, which is where the sort of sweet spot of experience and life skills sits, is then out of bounds. And even worse, the young people I hire, I know they'll leave as soon as they do have children, which tends to happen to most of them. And so it's a way of improving the value proposition. And ultimately, our view is that if you build a great school, at some point you will pull people to Lüderitz who will say, I want to move to Lüderitz so that I can have my children at that amazing school. And now I'll find which job I can find. And if I can't find one, why don't I start a business? And then you reverse the brain drain, which is, I think, much more powerful than creating a few hundred low-quality jobs.
Again, Daniel, I have to comment on your mindset of abundance as opposed to scarcity. And I just, again, it's not often that I get to speak to people that kind of understand that if I invest and spread more for more, everybody wins, as opposed to being a bit more competitive and almost kind of close doors and look after self-interest in quite a narrow way. Yeah. So I really commend you again for thinking systems-wise. And again, hope that brings an example to Southern Africa to kind of know that scarcity doesn't have to kind of play such a big role as it might in the past. There's so much in what you've said there that I'd love to kind of explore a bit more, and maybe in future we'll have time for more conversations. Just two comments that I want to pick up on is you speak again earlier a lot about the wording of enablement. And I love that, because I think a lot of people, when they think or hear this notion of transforming, they immediately think it's going to cost money. And yes, of course, there will be some money involved. There's no doubt about that. But, the examples you've given there, and also early in conversations, use what you have and just use cleverly and give people access to it, invite them in. So that it isn't actually quite as costly. It's about having the mindset of enabling, which in my opinion, then spreads wealth, access, inclusion. So I just want to kind of make sure that that very important point you've noted is not lost. There is a point that you've also raised where there is a little bit of this scarcity mindset. I have some empathy for that, because the history, at least in Southern Africa, is predominantly extractive industries, like you said, that come and take. So the societal culture that is developed here, I think, has biases of being exploited. So part of the work of transformation contributors like you, I think, is also psychologically to trust that people like you mean, as you say, to do good by doing good with profit making. So profit making doesn't have to be bad. If we approach it differently, it could actually add a lot of value.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you've come across that cultural conflict in your dealings.
Yeah.
Lüderitz in particular, perhaps.
Absolutely. It's everywhere on the planet. It's not limited to Southern Africa or to poor places. It's the human condition.
I agree.
And the key thing here is trust. So
yes.
Namibia is in a good place relative to some of its neighbors, because at least as an individual or as a company, you can trust that your assets and your property are protected, and that the rule of law generally applies. As much as you can trust that anywhere. If you look at what's going on in the US or in Europe, it's not. There is no sinecure in this, and history also shows that. But all things being relative, Namibia has a very stable framework for basically wealth creation, which is what we're talking about. And whether wealth creation is something that individuals are doing, or wealth creation is something that a town is doing, or that a country is doing, or that a school is doing, or an art collection or a museum is doing.
Yes.
What makes humans unique, and what is our blessing or our curse with our condition, is this ability to accumulate wealth in one way or another. And that can be cultural wealth, or wealth of stories, or it can be wealth in cash or in assets. But it all comes to the same thing. It's custodianship of what we own and making that grow. And so enabling that in every one of its forms is, I think, the key role that any leader has, in whichever role, whether in the private sector or in the public sector. And enabling it in the public sector generally actually just means get out of the way.
I love that. Absolutely.
Certainly it also means let's have some vision, and let's have the public sector say, let's charge off in that direction. But the public sector is no better at picking winners than the private sector is. And so when the public sector thinks that they're guiding everything and they're going to pick winners and how it goes, they will fail as often the private sector does, only with much more catastrophic consequences. So giving a direction, obviously great, that moves people and inspires, but largely it's about remove the barriers. We have this human tendency to, as regulators, to overreact to things that go wrong. Somebody steals some money, we introduce a new rule to stop that particular type of theft, and thereby inhibit everybody else who's honest,
unintended
and make their life all more complicated.
Yes.
We have to resist that urge to over-regulate everything, and just get out of the way and let people deploy their creativity.
Amen to that.
Yeah. and that doesn't mean entirely free for all.
No, of course not.
But it means a condition in which you say, rather than telling you upfront what you can or cannot do, let's just talk about principles, and if afterwards it proves that you did something that was maybe legal but clearly isn't right, then we're going to,
operate on a frame.
We're going to have to close that down.
To the context of Lüderitz again, it's really quite a poor town. Most of the people are classified as low or ultra low income earners. With that context, what is more important Is it economic development? Is it in social development, restitution, or is it on the technical infrastructure part? Where do you think priorities lie, looking at it from those lenses?
It's a bit of a new concept for me, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure it can be one or the other. It has to be a blend. But for Lüderitz, and that people in more developed listeners in more developed countries might find this difficult to understand. But everything starts with rule of law. So if you have a free-for-all, whether through crime, street crime, or regulators' crime, corruption or nepotism,
yes,
or corporates who get away with, then nothing positive can ensue from that. And in that, Namibia is not perfect, but is pretty solid, with some fragile areas. And the police and the armed forces being to me a major source of concern, with such poor training that I think at some point that really needs to be addressed. But okay, for a town like Lüderitz, it's not really an issue. But so rule of law is number one. Provision of stable electrical and water provision is number two. Like really the fundamentals of running a business. If you don't have consistent power, then as I saw in the ex-Soviet Union, where enormous swathes of the ex-Soviet Union were suddenly without power regularly, or South Africa, and all small businesses then fold. Because the cost of having a generator and what small business can survive that, and so you really, really hamper the economy if that isn't sorted out. A much forgotten but very much third place is waste management. Always out of sight, out of mind, but super important. Treatment of sewage, treatment of domestic industrial waste. These are the things that pile up and really cause enormous headaches later on down the line if they're not managed properly. All the other stuff, the sort of infrastructure, roads, Wi-Fi, phone, public transport, all of that obviously comes closely following. Yeah. And Lüderitz is an interesting example. All of that is in place. Some of it's quite rickety, but it functions. And so hence, as an economy, we function.
I really like that, and I agree with you. It's always bits of everything, and again, it will vary from case to case. At least in my experience, the only time where I think one should be cautious is almost to rather say, well, it's not what is the priority, it's just don't overly focus on trying to fix poverty. If poverty is your drive, rather fix economic development that allows people to access economic opportunity to help themselves, but it can't be pure from social restitution. That, in my experience as a placemaker, is the only time it really badly goes wrong. Otherwise, like you say, one has to jump across these three whenever the priority hits to kind of make sure fundamentals are slowly put in place. So I really, really agree with you. I want to come back as part of your earlier answer. In my opinion, you give such a humble and honest and sober view about humanity and their behavior, and one has to really appreciate that. So with that context, I want to ask you from this perspective, again, at least as a placemaker, in my experience, there are often so many diverse stakeholders involved in a town transformation, some of them with good intent, occasionally some with less good intent. They have different objectives, and or misaligned timeframes, and through that, mistrust, competition, self-interest can creep in. What would be your advice over what you've seen in your career and or in the last 4 years in Lüderitz would be to the decision makers of Lüderitz, or perhaps just more generally, what should one watch for? Worried about there? How does one avoid that?
Suffering the consequences of the decisions you make. And so accountability in its broadest sense, I think, is probably the salient one that is often overlooked. So if somebody in Windhoek is making decisions about Lüderitz and they aren't the right decisions, what's the consequence? Nothing.
Who carries the consequence?
If a company, I mentioned this before, I'm the owner and the CEO of my company and I live in Lüderitz, I'm going to make decisions that I can defend because I see my neighbors and my stakeholders and my employees in the shop, in the bar, at the school, in the restaurant. Mm-hmm. And many of the projects that function in Lüderitz, the senior people are either in Windhoek or in Walvis Bay or not even in the country at all. And they send people who have who have very explicitly no decision-making power, because that would make it difficult, and then you get drawn into the difficulty of local decision-making. Well, you're going to make better decisions if you get drawn into the difficulties of local decision-making powers. So I believe that decisions that affect the town should be drawn much more into the town and not be taken elsewhere.
I really agree with that. The only tension in my experience in some rural towns all over the world is fully agree with that principle. The slight dilemma that I've come across is on two levels, is that the local town stakeholders, or at least from a public sector, are willing and passionate and familiar, so they've got the context. But on the one hand, they don't necessarily have the experience or the skills, and not that they necessarily have to be experts, but enough skills to kind of lead that in an experienced way. And or two, they're quite dependent on decisions and or funding coming from elsewhere that doesn't quite understand the context. What would you be advised to balance those dilemmas versus that principle that it's preferable for local to lead?
I didn't mean that the endemic residents who've been there for, the old Buchters should have the decision-making power about everything. I think then you'd see a lot of stasis and perhaps more nepotism than you have today. I mean that the large projects and any economic development or major social projects should have people with decision-making power, should be moved temporarily or permanently to Lüderitz, rather than having managers sit in elsewhere or abroad.
Absolutely.
And only sort of the mercenaries being in those bars and in the shops who can't answer the questions.
Absolutely.
Or people, the community liaison people. In itself, that says that you're sort of putting somebody there to take the flak, but there's no intent for them to really have any authority. I think we should somehow coerce companies to put more of their decision-making senior people and government in town. When your children and your friends are there, then the urgency of doing something becomes quite a lot higher than if you're sitting somewhere else. And so you want to move quicker from the talk shops to the shovels in the ground.
Also, kind of in my experience, again, a little bit to that fear notion, find that a lot of people really want to, and they intellectually understand, but there's a lot of fear that prevents implementation, not because they want to obstruct, but because they're doubtful. They're kind of so afraid of making the wrong decision that they don't make any decisions. It doesn't always come from a bad place, is what I'm saying. Sometimes it is also actually just inherent fear. But if you're on the ground, then you do know what is perhaps a slightly higher priority day to day.
In life, there are very few decisions that are so unchangeable that making them right or wrong is of life importance. There are a few.
Sure.
And, those are important. It's important to go through those tests of life and make a right enough decision. But most decisions and most things we do, it just doesn't really matter if we don't get them right, because you can turn around and go back through that door and try another one.
Absolutely.
And yes, you might need to apologize, or it might be a bit shameful and you'll look stupid, but
you've got a very healthy balance there. I think that fear or unwillingness to explore, or I think fear of getting it wrong, whether that is for outward appraisal and judgment or it's for inner sense of perfection, is what I think makes identity transformations, which should actually be, like you explained right at the start of our conversation, almost exciting, exploratory, new opportunity, brings new context to your life or texture to your life. But I find that humanity mostly fears it rather than embrace it.
Yeah, we fear being seen to make mistakes.
Exactly. And society has, I think, driven us there to kind of say it's very competitive and it's judgmental. But I think, you seem to have transcended that. And I hope.
But is that true? I often think back to when I was a student, and you'd go out and drink too much and say something extraordinarily stupid and wake up the next morning like, oh my God. and then realize that actually nobody was listening, because everybody else was drunk and saying something stupid themselves, which you didn't even hear. And they're waking up thinking, what did I say?
So true.
And it, we get very obsessed with our own little foibles.
Focus of perfection. I couldn't agree with you more.
So we encountered something. So there's there's this concept of indigenous knowledge that's used a lot in sort of the most fashionable circles, if I may say it that way, which I always found a bit interesting. What does that mean? One of these current fashionable things to say that's part of the way humanity can save itself. And so I was always a bit skeptical, simply because I didn't understand what it meant, and it just sounded like a buzzword. But when we were in New Zealand, we do quite a lot of our work in partnership with the big Maori tribal association.
I didn't know that. Amazing.
And in one of those interactions, they introduced us to this concept of using a 200-year time frame. And the Haida First Nations in British Columbia and Alaska have taken over a lot of the forestry management already in the 70s. And they talk about 800-year forestry management plans.
Love that.
Driven not by romanticism or story, but driven by the fact that some of those trees become 800 years old. That's the cycle you need to plan for. And I suddenly thought that's fascinating as a concept, because if you look at 200 years, all sort of ego and contexts of genetic ego and whether it's my grandchildren who will have the benefits or yours sort of disappears, because 200 years later
it transcends. It's across.
It goes beyond what our small minds can encompass. And so you then come to a fairly pure view of, if you ask somebody, what would you like the world to look like in 200 years? Realistically, you get some very interesting outcomes as a thought experiment. So we do this occasionally with the company, and we sit down and we say, okay, what's your dreamer's view of the world in 200 years? What's your cynical, pessimistic view? Yes. Where sort of the Matrix and robots killing us, and what's the realistic view? And the spread is quite interesting for people to realize that they can happily describe sort of this fairy fantasy and this dystopian horror, and then something that actually looks a lot like today, and suddenly start thinking about what would lead to one or the other. And so you then walk things back and say, the decisions we're making today, are they contributing towards that world that you want, or are they contributing to the world that you don't want, or are they just noise and irrelevant? And I'm not saying you should be guided always by that, because getting to the future is obviously never going to be a straight line. Sometimes you have to go backwards and around to get somewhere if you want to achieve things. But it does help to open this frame of thinking, specifically around, do we prioritize oil and gas or hydrogen or jobs or infrastructure, or what does 1,000 jobs mean tomorrow if they last for 3 years? That's an interesting question.
Goals. Absolutely.
I'm not saying by posing the question that way that it's the wrong decision, but you frame it within a very much longer time frame, and suddenly I think some things become more apparent. So I think decision makers, walking them through that sort of, why do you want Lüderitz to look like Singapore?
Yeah,
is that the best you can imagine?
Out of context, exactly.
Lüderitz at the moment is a bizarrely charming, very exotic, traditional looking, derelict town full of oddballs at the end of the world. And some of those things you can't change, and some of those things I think you wouldn't want to change.
I was just about to say, you shouldn't change.
No, it's the derelict bit that you like to pull out.
Yeah.
The derelict bit is fine in the ghost town of Kolmoskop, just outside. That's derelict frozen in time as a museum. The derelict in Lüderitz maybe we'd like to replace by sort of green, clean, shockingly modern, super cool. Yes. But, other people might have different views.
I couldn't agree with you more.
That's the discussion I have. What do you want this town to feel like?
I think you give them the freedom to be objective, like you say, because if you don't have that kind of immediacy of time frames, it gives you very different perspectives. Yeah. And I think also different levels of accountability. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, but I'm hugely impressed by Wales. It's the only country that I'm currently aware of that's actually beginning to create legislation whereby new town developments, new economic investments are being put through a lens of future generation commitments to, again, just lift it to a different standard, as opposed to, like you say, the very short-term, near-term, human way of becoming quite short-term about how it impacts you or your generation, as opposed to thinking much more forward. Yeah. So it's beginning to mirror in law, actually, which might be helpful or not, but I think at least that's there. So, Daniel, in my experience, of course, I'm sure you will know, and I think a lot of your answers is implied that you're well aware of this, transforming a place or a company or people or a town indeed is never linear. In the case of Lüderitz at least, or other towns that you've observed, what are the unexpected complexities or barriers that you think have stepped in that you think came as a surprise to you in terms of a town transformation initiative?
Difficult. That's a very difficult question. Probably two things. One, distrust, so conspiracy theories that build. And the other would be conflicting visions of the future. Maybe three things. The third is insistence on dealing with real or perceived grievances of the past rather than moving towards a sort of shared vision of the future. And what I mean by that is that I don't think we as humans can ever do anything positive unless we posit it as clarity around where we want to move towards.
Fully agree.
And so you create a shared vision. Enough people need to embrace that in enough of its aspects, and then it tends to become a lot easier to have all these different bits of the machine working together. But if you get conflicting visions where people just say, well, that vision that's your rich man's dream, but actually we want something different, then obviously you have a problem. And that's always difficult. And we assume that this great utopia that we have in mind, that everybody shares that, and we don't often reflect often enough that some people have very, very different views of what they'd like the future to look like.
Absolutely agree. And I think in those instances, quite often we want people to draw that out, but also try and, I wouldn't say want to appease different layers of visioning, but to actually just explain to people, starting with something more humble doesn't exclude that far future. And me saying no to the far future doesn't mean that I disagree with it. Yeah. It's just that I want to rather prioritize getting some first humble runs on the board that makes sense, that can anchor and allow. But to jump from here to there in very remote places seems implausible, I think could misdirect, and you might do things in the wrong order. And therefore, I agree with you to kind of, could people settle around a 3 to 5 year vision first and be very humble about that and get some successes that builds credibility, builds trust, to your very important point, and tangible evidence so that on that more can come or not, depending on how it unfolds, because it's obviously not all predictable. And I think for people not knowing, it takes about 15 to 20 years to transform a place. One can't make decisions now. For that 20 years, you can make it through a lens to avoid big mistakes. But in my opinion, to kind of be a little bit more humble in the beginning to build cohesion on that.
And to be conscious of the very different levels of experience and knowledge of having seen different places. So
yes,
maybe two examples. One of Lüderitz, where there's a piece of land that I've asked to consider for this school vision we've got of building a sort of world-class boarding school where we get kids from all over the planet coming to do their education in this academically and adventurously ambitious environment in the exotic sort of surroundings. And to me, it's blindingly obvious that something like that, if we can pull it off, would be of huge value to the town in terms of the number and quality of jobs it would create.
Absolutely.
The type of people that would be brought in, the network and that it gives to them, the Namibians who are in this school, the shared facilities that the town can use, be it sporting or cultural. And then you get taken completely offside by some people say, no, but that we had that piece of land in mind for a gated community for 40 or 50 luxury villas. I mean, why on earth would you want that? Exactly. Like, to me, a gated community of rich people fenced off from the rest of the town is a sign of deep, deep failure. And it's a sign of this is a horrible town. And it's not something you should want and actively want to engage as a town council at all. It's the opposite. You want, how can we ensure that the rich live among everybody else?
Absolutely.
Besides, what jobs does that bring? 50 houses. What does that bring? 50 cleaning ladies and 50 gardeners, a few guards, all low-level jobs. But the island we were talking about, where the cruise ship industry wants to start
We're talking
coming,
about
because
right?
Santorini has too many cruise ships, and so the Greek government wants them to go elsewhere and not all go to the same place. And to me, it's also astonishing that there are islanders who think that that's a good idea.
I fully agree.
While all you need to do is visit pretty much any small tourist town on the planet that has made the mistake of having cruise ships come in, and then I'm sure you would decide that
It's not the
two or
way to
three
go.
people will make a lot of money till they go bankrupt, and then their business gets owned by the cruise ships, and everybody else, life degrades.
Exactly, because I mean, to your point, I went or had the fortune to see Santorini before cruise ships stopped there, 1997 or something like that, and I've decided never to go back since.
don't
In
go
fact,
back.
I was detracted. I don't want to be disappointed by what I see and heartbroken by how a beautiful island would have been. And in Morgus, like I know we're both passionate about, don't want to see the same part there. Just in terms of your school, I don't think I've had the opportunity to share with you that I'm from afar have been a huge admirer of what you and your wife are doing there. And one of the reasons for that is, of course, having seen quite a lot of town transformation projects and working on them, to the very point you've made, it's quite often the unexpected focus areas that becomes the success. And I think they're beginning to call it the Bilbao effect as a consequence of the Bilbao Guggenheim Museum that unexpected became the transformation catalyst. But to a port's school, we've got an example on the west coast of South Africa, Kleinseer, that also coincidentally is part of the De Beers or Beers Anglo-American mining town legacy, where the town, of course, was built purposes for mining and then under threat because of economic decline. And they couldn't find economic reason to give it a new life, despite it being a necessity from a social risk perspective, from the mining perspective. They started a school for people that have disability or learning disabilities, and unexpectedly became a huge transformation catalyst. So to your point, it doesn't have to be the big glossy things or what we think. It should be contextually unique. And I think what you're trying to do, I hope people hear you, could be a huge softening to the landscape that brings a whole different dimension and texture to it. So I really, really...
Yeah, and entirely independent of the oil price, diamond price, or the ups and downs of industries or recessions. Children are a commodity that we continue to produce at large numbers, and we continue to need to educate them.
Correct.
State schooling, I think, is in crisis in different ways in every country in the world, and people are seeking richer, broader experiences. And here we can mesh that with a need to also pull up opportunity poor people and expose them to experiences that they wouldn't otherwise have.
Exactly.
And ironically, I mean, what people often don't understand is I'm obviously that happens from an altruistic perspective, but it's also that I think it's imperative that the richer children, say my own children, but also the paying pupils, that they are exposed to friends who come from
different
poor backgrounds and therefore fuse this world in which the ideal human being is just as comfortable and just as polite and just as interesting with a plumber as with President Obama.
Correct.
People who can only speak to one or the other, that's a degraded world in which there are no positives that come out of that. So we need to address that. So I mean, it's a long, ambitious project. We started only 3 years ago, I suppose, 15 children, then 45 last year.
Sure, it's already that. That's amazing.
At about 70 now. And the next step, because Lüderitz is too small to supply sufficient paying pupils to subsidize the non-paying ones, and just too small to have a school that's of a scale that is self-sustaining economically, as in covers its cost. The next step is to bring in boarding pupils, which I think is also essential, not just from an economic perspective, but to enrich what otherwise is a fairly insular community.
My husband comes from an engineering background, much like you. And we quite often talk about the fact that countries that for just for history purposes, come from a very engineering hardcore mindset, doesn't necessarily yet value the decision-making of these softer elements. And I, for one, would be so happy if Namibia's got exposure to other, yes, one could call it industries, but other parts of human life that can soften perhaps the very hard industries a bit, to bring more arts and creativity, to rebalance, the texture, which is...
Now, maybe at this moment, in my opinion, is in an extraordinary moment of rugged individualism. The land of the brave isn't just a nomer, but it is actually true. It's a hard place, and it breeds stoical, optimistic.
That's right.
Sometimes fatalistic, but generally stoical, optimistic.
Exactly.
Forward-looking, open-minded people with enormous resilience. So I think it's a tiny population, but the world doesn't need millions of great leaders. The world needs in every generation a handful of people who, in different areas, in different industries, do great things. And I think that with this school, we can craft a whole generation of Namibians who go improve the world, but also come back and improve Namibia. Every place and every person is a work in progress.
Yes, and like you also kind of described a little bit earlier, is the way that you're approaching your school is also not just academic; it's also real life implementation.
Yeah.
Your earlier point that perhaps implementation is missing, in some people's education.
Yeah, very much so. So a lot of debating, a lot of model United Nations, but also just a lot of crafts, robotics, coding, drama, theater, debating. Sports, certainly, but it's partly because we don't have the facilities or the grass, but partly also from ideology. It's not so focused on rugby or cricket. I think the days that being good at that prepared you for life are sort of over. It has a role to play, but that whole breadth of life skills and getting kids to drive boats and cars by the time they're 14, 15, instead of waiting till they're already fully adult before we allow them to do things. Also exposing them to danger earlier and teaching them how to handle risk rather than be afraid of it all the time and push it out of their way. And by doing that, make people who are gallant and bold and approach life by grabbing it by the ears and embracing it rather than by running away from it.
If I was a child now, I would have loved to have joined your school. That's for sure. I'm almost part of me wish I was young again to
I'm
get excited.
doing a bit of advert.
And so you should. As unfortunately our conversation is drawing to a close, I know, because I could feel like I could speak to you for hours, is coming to this notion of successes. And you used a beautiful example of perhaps a sort of closed community of wealthy people in a sort of closed community is not something you would describe as success. So let me ask you, at least in the case of Lüderitz, and you now being and having a very strong vested interest there, in about 15 years from now, what would you think success should, or hopefully, what would that look like for you? For Kelp Blue and or for you as
I would envisage a town with obviously massive kelp forests and the whole thriving peripheral industries around that of divers and tourists and people doing multi-trophic farming, which means sort of shellfish and things, and line fishing alongside the forest. Products being made, biostimulants, leathers, foams, pharmaceuticals from kelp. I'd also envisage a fishing industry that still exists but has radically changed into one that is producing very high value crayfish and tuna and monkfish rather than at low volume going straight to local consumers, but also to the highest paying markets on the planet rather than this high volume, low value industry we've got today. A town that still has its diamonds, but a bespoke sort of locally made, locally polished, and that attracts, as a result of all this tourism, young people coming for adventure and lifestyle and ultra luxurious, high paying, high dollar value pensioner tourism. Plus, then the renewable energy, I think, definitely is something I deeply embrace. Hydrogen, I'm slightly skeptical about if it's done in that it's done in a way that isn't some huge industrial monster.
Yes.
And then underneath that, I think people come to the town now and see its charm, and some very eccentric people like us think, "Gosh, it'd be great to live here." But I'd like to see more people think, "Why wouldn't I live here?" Because how green, how modern, but also how integrated it is. At the moment, you still have the sort of apartheid legacy of a rich town and a poor town, which is physical. All the all the commercial and retail sits in between, and so it's a sort of wall, and that needs to architecturally be changed by town planning.
I agree.
So that you have a more blended group of poor, middle class, rich, all
very much the mining legacy that had that social hierarchies.
Yeah, that all live among each other, and of course, what's fundamental to that is security. You can't have a town in which there's security for the rich but none for the poor.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
We know from this region what that leads to. So they are fairly simple things to fix. This doesn't cost big dollars. It costs a bit of vision and a bit of commitment, and some people in charge with some grit.
Yeah,
who get supported by their community, of course. That's also essential. And Lüderitz has all of that, and it's ready to do positive things. It's a town that does put its shoulders under it and contribute when people are aligned around a vision.
Just to complement that, and maybe I'm just asking the same question in another way, but if we kind of sort of say in 15 years from now, but maybe even using your prior example of Lens of 200 years from now, what would you like future generations to be telling about this moment of transformation in Lüderitz? What would the stories you would like people to tell about this moment of shifting an identity?
Well, I'd like them to call it the Cub Revolution.
The what? I love that. I'm so honest. I love that. I'm going to use that.
Probably by then, I think I was once told in the context of innovation that when you start doing something new that hasn't been done before, everybody thinks you're crazy and laughs at you. Then people start to feel threatened because, of course, you're changing the way business is done, and so you become the enemy. And then when you're successful and your innovation actually works, then people think you're irrelevant because, that was obvious. Why does...
It was never new, yeah.
Everybody knew that was the obvious thing.
Oh, that's a nice way to do it.
So that's a very humbling way of looking at, don't wait for anybody to cheer about what you're doing. And remember, I would really like it if the town would be seen as a place that was defined by its school, by its university faculty. The NUST project that the Waterfront Development Company is phenomenal and is still work in progress. But having 900 students and the faculty around it also changes the atmosphere of a town and blends rich and poor and forces then the security apparatus to make sure that security is there for all these young students. So there's a number of things in play already, the school, NUST, the KELP project, and then a number of the other projects that hopefully provide a short-term financial boost that could allow it to become a town that is really an example of sustainable energy use, value add rather than extraction on the African coast, which is unusual, and people power and people wealth creation that is brain power that sucks people towards this exotic, strange place, and it will always be Marmite, by which I mean people who hate it or love it. There's no sort of middle ground with Lüderitz. It's people hate it or love it, and the people who love it are all a bit strange.
I'm just so glad these types of places still exist in the world. I think for people like us, for sure. I too would hope it remains that way.
We do get some normal people who come to this, but they don't stay normal for very long.
Or they don't stay. I completely get that. Daniel, my two final questions for you, a little bit more advice, and one more general and one specific to Lüderitz. In general, what advice would you give to placemakers or decision makers in town transformations to make sure that they allow the identity of a place to transform, but not lose important elements of its past? What advice would you give now that you've experienced quite a bit around how they could approach that? What's the recommendation?
Take the time to build a bold vision with everybody's involvement. I know that's frustrating because people don't show up, and then when they do, they think they haven't been involved. Well, you're actually involving them. But build the bold vision, bold around a few major things, not too many, not trying to address everything at the same time, but a few major things that apparently are the ones that resonate most. And then be really dogged and determined around those. But the other side of it is you need some early, easy, quick wins. Because
fully agree.
Humanity everywhere has skepsis around what the public sector does and what strategic thinkers do. They just think it's another workshop, another talk shop with a nice plan, and nothing will come of it. So you have to couple it with some quick, easy wins that everybody says, that's great, that's what we wanted. And then you mobilize that movement and to realize that perfection is not within grasp. You're never going to get 100% of people behind you. Small towns are no different from anywhere else. They're probably even more vicious, meaning that you will have a third of them who are for you. Therefore, a third will be against, because they have a sort of vendetta against the third who are for you. It's got nothing to do with the content of what you're proposing.
It's just
and a third are indifferent. And so the art of politics in small towns consists of, when there needs to be a vote, you need to mobilize that indifferent third for a short period of time. That's all. Don't try and convince the other side.
Worth it.
Just move forward, stay cheerful,
be
extraordinarily perseverant while being very flexible. If what you're doing isn't winning, drop that, do something else.
I think it's very sobering advice. The only one that I could think is for people to kind of be mindful of time on the one hand, not to expect too much too soon, but on the other hand, to put in a steady pace. It's kind of that sweet spot, almost the Goldilocks effect. Not too much and not too little, but definitely not at all, and not expected overnight. To kind of be quite sober about that, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, you have to be very impatient, but you also have to.
Exactly.
Your impatience can't boil over. You have to accept that if you're pushing a piece of string after all.
Yes.
Pushing it harder doesn't make it move far.
What are your hopes for the community of Lüderitz at a parting word?
I hope that between the various projects that are on the ground, like ours, and are perhaps coming in one shape or form, and the dimensions of which are uncertain, that the ones that really pull through are the deep, long cultural ones, the university, the school, and there are a number of other similar initiatives. And I hope that combination of more robust, consistent job creation, some of which is in an erratic industry that has ups and downs, and some which isn't, and that has a lot of diversity, allows people to also move around from jobs and open their minds, and that more people are therefore drawn into discussions with physicists at the university or music teachers. There are only a few bars, and then people can open their minds and broaden from the fairly limited topics of conversation that have to do with the town now to being much more engaged, thoughtful, involved citizens who have choices. Life ultimately is about choice and about self-determination, and giving people the feeling, but also the inspiration that they are in control of their destiny. And that is the only spark often that's needed to change people from sort of victim role, sit around and drink and complain, to people who are bustling and busy and busy creating rather than
people then make inherently wise decisions for themselves. It is about that term, enabling people to make good choices, and for them just to give them the tools and the environment in which to do that.
Yeah, humans are either wandering through the forest in a state of atrophy and eating what they get and feeling put upon and miserable, or they're gardening.
I love that.
I think we're happiest and it's best for us all. We are gardeners, ultimately. We're custodians. We need to take better care of our wealth creation, our families, our environment.
I love that.
The long-term future, and plant some trees that might only come up 200-300 years from now.
Well, on that metaphor, I think it's very apt that we close there. So, Daniel, on behalf of Lüderitz, thank you for the gardening that you are doing, literally with your kelp garden, so to speak, but also on the human gardening you are doing. And I'm so grateful for Lüderitz that you are there. And thank you for joining me today. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, and your insights into humanity and or identity is going to stay with me for a while. So thank you for that. It was a great pleasure having you.
Thank you, Ruth. A pleasure to be here.